Hello, everyone. This is Aran. I'm an educator of philosophy based in Austin, Texas. Today, I'm with my dear friend, Trent. Hello, Trent.
Hi, everybody. This is Sean, your old friend. I'm also based in Austin, Texas. I'm a cultural historian of early medieval Europe and late medieval China. Excited with y'all to further our journey on human nature.
Yes. So, as we presented this idea to you guys a few episodes ago, our new direction is focused in Versuche on the concept of human nature. We have started this path by looking into the relationship between the concept of human nature and evolutionary biology, how evolutionary biologists and philosophers of biology have a focus on the concept of human nature. And we have taken this path because we think there is something very important in the contrast that biology creates to maybe a mischaracterization, maybe overgeneralization, but still an important feature of history of the concept of human nature, which a lot of times has been the history of the concept of human essence, where essence have been understood as something fixed, as a core, it's just there no matter what, or some sort of even moral guidance for our direction and a condition for our flourishing. Now, what has been interesting in this analysis is whether evolutionary biology is just, you know, says no to any concept of human nature. According to evolutionary biology, you cannot both believe in evolutionary biology and believe in human nature, or there is a way that we can like reframe the concept of human nature. To answer this question, we have been focusing on Grant Ramsey's Human Nature, a short book on philosophy of biology and its relationship with the concept of human nature. And we have made a couple of points so far. In the past episode, we discussed the idea that human essence and human nature do not need to point at the same thing. And the emphasis that Ramsey brings to this conversation is very much about nature versus essence. Because for Ramsey, the question is not so much about how do we identify a human being, but how do we identify nature. And because of that, the emphasis is not so much about, for instance, speciation and what determines the distinction between us and like, our great cousins, the apes, but the emphasis is what is nature itself, which in a lot of ways is not just about human beings, as this is a specific species, but about any other species. Now, what Ramsey thinks, um, broadly speaking, the options are in front of us in having the concept of human nature that is not about human essence in this kind of a fixed, rigid way. Um, is number one, the trade bin account, and second, the trade cluster account. Right? So for Ramsey, the trade bin account is about it's a pattern of demarcation because when we speak of okay human nature, we want human nature, we don't want human essence. We have to decide how are we going to distinguish between human nature and the non-nature part. And in all of these discussions, there is one important assumption that is going to be important for discussion next time, which is that the concept of trait is presupposed as the unit of measurement. Meaning, our question is how do we demarcate which traits are part of human nature and which one are not? And in that demarcation, what is important for us is to see like what kind of method of demarcation we have. Now, the trait bin strategy, as the name suggests, is just a bin, meaning that you by this measurement or another measurement, you throw the first trait there, then you throw the second trait there, and the third trait, and so on and so forth. Meaning that there is no necessarily we don't care about how traits are connected. We just care that they are there, and the demarcation strategy one of the major ones is could be statistical frequency. We're gonna go study human beings see what is mostly present in human beings, put all of those traits into a list, turn that list into like a trait bean, we have human nature. Problem. If we do that, we miss out on characteristics in humanity that are not necessarily frequent, but very much characteristic of humanity. Existence of menopause. Another strategy is to approach this based on the nature-culture distinction. Say that whatever is the unit existing in the evolutionary scenario is the trait that we will put in the bin, and whatever is merely cultural, we just take it out. This returns to the basic understanding of the concept of nature as something natural. And the trouble with that is this sharp distinction between nature and culture is not really sustainable. Even for the most, even basic evolutionary, quote unquote, evolutionary traits that we have about, like, how our digestive system works, right? Cultural elements, for instance, banning of certain food because of a specific kind of a ritual, influences our biology. We cannot, that group of people who went for the ban are going to have a very hard time, consuming that. Maybe it even kills them, right? Culture changed nature. So how are we gonna kind of have this kind of a very rigid distinction? Okay. So the solution that Ramsey has, and that's what we're going to talk about in this episode, is that forget about bins. Let's talk about clusters. Because when we start thinking about clusters, we can talk about relations. And only when we start talking about relations, we can have a coherent view of human nature. Before getting started, Trent, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I think it was a great summary, and it connects what we are concerned about in general with this specific text. So I think the listeners hopefully are just very eager and curious to discover what kind of alternative Grant Ramsey is proposing.
Yes. So what Ramsey proposes here as and it's an example of a trait cluster account. There is competition, and we'll briefly mention the competition here, but hopefully we have time to talk about it in the next episode more. The one that Ramsey holds, he calls Life History Trait Cluster, LTC, for short. And there are a couple of things that are very important in his account. Number one, Ramsey thinks we can only think about human nature as a here and now kind of a concept. Meaning, by human nature, he doesn't mean that this has been always the case, this will always be the case. The method will be the same, right? If you want to say, like, what was human nature, 200,000 years ago, or like 200 years ago, whatever that, like, time period is, like before agriculture, let's say, right? We can go apply the same method, but we can only come up with an answer of like human nature at that specific time. Now, how broadly we're understanding time, Ramsey doesn't tell you much about that. Like, if we have an understanding of human nature here and now, are we thinking about 2024? We're thinking about 21st century. We're thinking about the last 1,000 years. Like, how could we delineate time? Ramsey doesn't tell you much about that. The thing that he tells you about, though, is that it's not just about going and taking a snapshot of humanity and see, like, what is statistically frequent in humanity at this moment. It's about going and finding the causally sustained relations between the traits and probability of their flexibility, which is another way to say it's about probability of their inflexibility, right? Meaning that traits are not equal. and their frequency is not a factor in their inequality, right? It is not a random fact that discrepancies in like chromosomes are exceedingly rare in humanity, as opposed to, some psychological characteristics of being rude, like something like that. Like the fact that it's a characteristic in humanity of, say, being rude might be frequent, but not causally sustained, is that all the factors that come together to make that happen, they don't form a robust cluster. But all the things that exist there for sustaining the chromosome structure of humanity, and make the probability of its flexibility very, very low, never impossible, but very, very low, is not a random fact. It gets connected to, many, many other issues. For instance, like we can say that, the discrepancy in the chromosome structure in humanity makes certain diseases or makes certain genetic malfunctions more possible for humanity, and they just disappear. It's not a sustainable system. Also, like this kind of like uniformity could come from the fact that, genetic uniformity or genetic adjacency comes from the fact that we keep reproducing within if you couple with someone who is closer to you genetically, that match makes it's more possible to create a uniform structure at the end of it, because you're reproducing, but also you're able to reproduce because you're already adjacent genetically. So they reinforce one another. That's just an example of it. That it's not just a random fact that we came up with this genetic distribution. It's because here's how reproduction works. Here's how, genetic works. These are limitations, sometimes chemical, sometimes biological, sometimes cultural elements could reinforce them, right? Banning incest, right? And kind of reinforcing this kind of disappearance of certain traits, right? That would have been maybe like there would have been more diversity in like distribution of chromosomes, if we didn't have certain cultural norms. And all of this is part of the causal structure, right? So the main idea that Ramsey has is that we are looking at patterns. These patterns are clusters of traits. These clusters of traits are not non-randomly connected to one another. It's not about some, just accident that these are the case, these are connected. There are all sorts of reasons why they are connected. Okay, so that's the backbone of his approach. Now, there are some other points that he mentions that are also important to different degrees. One of those is that like sequence of traits also matter, right? The fact that we grow in a certain way, that tells us something about what kind of an entity we are, how these clusters are working, right? In what sense it gets connected to the pattern of our existence. I think with that, the main point, and we don't necessarily need to get into the details of it, what Ramsey is re-emphasizing is that these traits are non-random and their history matters in this way, right? The fact that, gray hair emerges at a certain point in certain people is something itself very much kind of constrained, and we kind of function under developmental plans, if that makes sense. Like we are always kind of like going into life cycles of different types, and those life cycles are not random. And lastly, Ramsey mentions this whole point is not just about the traits that exist, but also the unrealized trait associations, meaning that this is also about the possibilities that exist in humanity as part of its human nature. So it's not just what you can point at, but it's about a probability distribution that you can point at. Not a trait that you can point at, but a probability distribution of traits that you can point at, no matter how frequently it actually exists, but how possible it is. And again, this is just a snapshot view of humanity at this very specific point, not anything beyond that. The last thing I'm going to say, and then Trent, you jump in and say what you want to say, is that there is another account that is very much about trait clusters, and it's a process-oriented variation, and that we need to think about human beings as processes within nature, and that is introduced by Dupre. Ramsey dismisses that because he thinks that everything can be a process. And there is no need for introducing some sort of a process metaphysics to think about human nature. Whether something is a process or it's not, it's a practical, pragmatic question. It's not about something that could be about the core of humanity, that we are at the core, merely process. Trent?
Yes, I really like what you summarized. It's a rather complicated concept, and I'm not like a biology expert, so I was constantly thinking with a kingdom. That's like an analogy to this. So basically, he is saying that what comparing to the Bing trait model is like the kingdom. What really matters to the kingdom is kind of the institution, the protocol that like binds different parts of this kingdom together. They are not like seen on your as a wall between like your territory and the neighbor state territory, but rather it's like how does the taxation links like your finance with like maybe military power. That's why like whenever we see certain like war happens that the state your kingdom expenditure like grows, those causal links that are not random, and this introduces kind of sustainability into the kind of composition of this kingdom. So that's what you gave with like biological examples. I think the analogy here is fitting. When I was reading this, I think two things come to my mind. First is I think his model is coherent. The way that he deals with the individual life's history trait cluster is directly applicable to his generalization of humankind or human society in general. Like that life history trait thing he mentions, we're also talking about a community. So the universal individual question for him is not a challenge. He considers that his model like suitable to answer both how to characterize a human individual and how to characterize a human species. They are like transparent, translatable for him. The second thing I have is perhaps, yes, even though he mentions the sequence matters, so like whether the state first has the Department of War or first have the Department of like Finance, that matters to the composition of this state. But he does not. This is not a criticism, just to point it out. He does not talk about whether his law of causality is changing across time. So like time matters not just in the sense like we are concerning here and now and what is now, how to delineate time, but also whether this causality itself. What he means by causally sustainable or sustained is something that changes given how individual act in reaction, or individual traits move or migrate in reaction to the patterning. So I think that's how we do Versucher. He dismisses the Duperrey, saying it's like a process oriented, it's not compatible, it's not relevant to stuff. So we're gonna read the Duperrey and see like whether a process oriented approach would perhaps account for a changing or evolving causality, or it assumes the same thing as like Grant Ramsey does here. So I think with that said, we've already given like rundown of life history trait, and how is his theory received in the field?
Yeah, I think that's an important point that you mentioned there, that like it's gonna become clear after we discuss our criticism of Ramsey, why like Dupre's like point about process might be actually very charming for our purposes. But more of that for later. As you mentioned, it's time for us to kind of look at what kind of backlashes uh, Ramsey has faced in like having this LTC account, life history cluster account, and there are three criticisms, and yeah, they're interesting in very different ways. So the first problem is permissiveness, right? Some people have said that, hey, like if we're thinking about this nature in this way, everything is connected to everything, and it doesn't seem like that we're really doing much. Like it's not like that we are really marketing anything. It seems like everything could be human nature. Everything is human nature. That's it. And Ramsey's point is that yes, every trait could be part of human nature. Every trait that is part of human nature right now could disappear, of course. But that doesn't mean that in any given time all traits are equal, because not all traits are causally linked in the same way. Not all traits are the probability of flexibility for different traits not the same, right? Maybe that changes, right? Maybe that changes in like 500,000 years. Well, something could change, but at the moment the pattern is stable, right? And if there is like a nuclear bomb dropped at every place in human live in, there could be major changes in like these traits in a short period of time. Like what I mean is that it's just not so much about time, it's about all sorts of other things. If there's like a cosmic event that changes Earth, then a lot of things could change. If we lose access to clean water, then a lot of things could change. So all of this can change, but it doesn't mean that at any given time all traits are equal. In that sense, Ramsey thinks this is not about permissiveness, it's just about flexibility that reflects the nature of evolutionary biology. The second criticism is that kind of returns to the basic point that we mentioned, that for Ramsey, what matters here is natural sciences. Like what matters in terms of like what are we studying is human nature insofar as it pertains to natural scientific world. And directly, indirectly, explicitly, implicitly, Ramsey mentions that that's the way to go with human nature. If you want to make it useful, you need to come up with the one that is compatible with natural sciences. Now, the criticism that Ramsey receives because of this approach is that this kind of turns humanity into just an objective study and takes the human out of the human nature, meaning that like we are actively creating narratives and maps of meaning to make sense of what we are. And that doesn't seem to be important for Ramsey, although that's a very important part of our existence. Why not? And Ramsey's point is that, look, I'm not rejecting creativity or imagination. What I'm rejecting that our imagined myths do not change human nature, right? He mentions in 33, just as our solar system is a structure of lumps of matter moving in predictable ways, human nature is a structured set of traits distributed in predictable ways over life histories, appearing, disappearing, and transforming over the span of these histories. So we can definitely have a crappy, view of like what a solar system is. We can have an Earth-centric view of solar system. That doesn't make the solar system Earth-centered. Like our mistakes about solar system doesn't change solar system. Our mistakes about human nature does not make human nature different, right? This is not so much about criticism, but I just noticed that how this could be kind of incongruent with another thing that Ramsey says about that kind of element of the cultural influence. But I will save this for the criticism. I will mention it there. In any case, autopoiesis or like any sort of, self articulation is not necessarily anything important for Ramsey. What matters is this kind of like externalized human beings like are studied from outside, uh, and that will be enough. Like what narratives we're part of, what myths that doesn't matter for human nature, and that's not a rejection of creativity. And lastly, the core veneer challenge. And the core veneer challenge is not so much a direct criticism of Ramsey, but it's just like a criticism that exists, which is like, when we think about nature, we need to kind of go back. All of these cultural stuff are just like these, superficial things that we have added, like beneath that, the reality waits for us. And this is just like, this has been taken in many different ways. Like, you think about Rousseau. You think about Rousseau having a very kind of optimistic view of a state of nature, right? And culture is this corrupting, element that has ruined our lives and like kind of introduced us to this kind of very harsh competition, so on and so forth. On the other hand, you have someone like Hobbes that thinks the opposite. That if you take away anything from humanity by nature, like when the cloak is off, we're this kind of a disgusting, power grabbing, self-interested monster, right? For Ramsey, these are all fictitious, ideas. They're not really representing anything real. And he uses an analogy that I think it is interesting. He says, culture is not a cloak we wear that we can doff in order to see the nature beneath. Nor are any non-human primates naked humans. Humans without culture is like water without oxygen. What remains is not oxygen-free water, it is hydrogen. And I think the idea is that like this imagined version of humanity is not like that imagined version is not humanity anymore. That's just a different thing. And that's the problem with it. And he identifies a couple of problems, general problems that exist with these types of accounts, the cloak accounts, the core veneer accounts. For instance, sometimes people are obsessed with how early a trait emerges, right? And we can think about this historically, right? Like, we were at the very beginning, we were not very, cultural, institutional, we're just hanging out in nature, and based on who you ask, we were either like angels or monsters, right? But so what came first doesn't determine what we are, not at all. Just like an early trait in a human being, in an individual human being, doesn't determine what they are, not at all. a lot of traits emerge very later in an individual, and they're very important. Again, menopause. Of course, it's not an equivalent. That's not necessarily a good equivalent for the historical side, but we can think about that as an analogy, right? Maybe something happened later on in the cultural development of humanity that is far more significant than that original trait. Like, there is no reason for going back and looking at how, hunter-gatherers like acted and try to see that that's the way to go because that's our nature. No, that was something that happened, and other things happened, and they're kind of interconnected in weird ways. But just because that was earlier doesn't mean it's any better, or it's any more of a goal than anything else. Of course, like how common a trait is doesn't make it part of the core. We've already talked about that when we discussed like this kind of a statistical frequency problem, right? That common by no means mean more important. Again, menopause, a lot of things that happens through aging, a lot of like exceptions that exist in humanity, those are very significant in characterizing humanity. And of course, the whole point is that naturalness of a trait cannot determine its coreness, because you should notice how absurd this will sound if you think about something, human language, because human language is in many ways a cultural trait, but if there is a core, probably people will call language as part of that core, right? So for Ramsey, this whole core veneer collapses because it just becomes either about time or about frequency. And it always includes a shady version of isolating a set of traits and calling them natural in a bin version of this of human nature. And for Ramsey, that just like is an empty train.
Yes, I really like your summary of these critiques and Grant Ramsey's responses to these critiques. I think this dialogue between Ramsey and his colleagues or opponents really helped me at least to think how think about the differences between the concept of human nature for him and for us. Let's take perhaps number two as an example, like human out of a human nature challenge. He's basically just admitting like human nature for him has nothing to do with the subject-object relationship of the human individual. So in this line of inquiry, he's not interested in, or his model does not account for how human myth or meaning making could change perhaps the causality, how such like traits are interconnected, and also like his emphasis, his relationship with the disciplinarity is also very obvious, that human nature for him belongs to the domain of a specific discipline. So no Supreme Court of Justice is needed, at least, to really account for it. We can just go observe and catalog them and describe them, and in each moment, of course, there are different ways of describing them. Some are better, like the cluster one. Some are really bad and not justifiable, like the core veneer or bin version, or the evolutionary that introduced like a very rigid type, different rigid separation between cultural and natural traits. So I think this list of critiques really help us to position Grant Ramsey's conceptualization of human nature, and perhaps that we can, in so doing, know better what we want from like a human nature discussion.
Yes, I think that's really important, and I think the point that you mentioned about the kind of like Supreme Court, like human nature as like, the final court. I think that's a very interesting question posed to Ramsey, because I'm not sure about that, because in
Interesting.
one sense he seems to think the final court is biology, or like scientific inquiry about human nature, right? Like if you have a dispute, even anthropologists have a conception of human nature. If a historian has a conception of human nature, to see who is right, they should go back to biology and look at that. On the other hand, though, he repeatedly recognizes the role of culture, which is not a natural object of biology, right? Then when he thinks about human nature in the context of, as it pertains to scientific understanding of humanity, science, I'm guessing, is referring to natural sciences. Then what happened to the cultural part? Because it seems like that he wants to say this is the object of biology, but then he wants to say as nothing could be an object of biology in this specific conversation unless it recognizes the role of culture. So it's not the culture object of biology, or it's like it's where does it stand in that whole realm? For now, let's talk about one last thing in Ramsey and see what really he wants to do with this concept. But there's also a very important question. There's just like, what is the end goal of discussing human nature? Why are we talking about human nature? So Ramsey gives us four options of like what we can do with human nature, right? Number one is human nature could show us which traits are susceptible to enhancement, right? And he agrees that we can have that, right? If we are kind of creating a map of causal links between traits, and we have some scientific knowledge of how to manipulate different things, um, we definitely can work on certain traits, and we can see that which of them are more stubborn, harder to mess with, harder to change, harder to enhance, whatever that means. But we can have that. Probably the ones that are part of human nature at any given time are harder to change. The others are easier to change, right? So he's in full agreement there. Human nature could elucidate the risks or benefits of enhancement projects, definitely, in terms of like genetic, modifications, in terms of like going through a massive like, digestive regime that is very odd, right? In terms of like, even think about, you know, policies in different areas, and exposure to certain chemicals. Like all of these, we can just see like what this kind of medical approach, what can it do for us and what it cannot do. What human nature as a concept cannot do for us, according to Ramsey, though, is that human nature could not enumerate the quote unquote natural traits and provide us with a target for enhancement. Related to that, human nature could not provide us with new moral principles about what should and should not be enhanced. Basically, for Ramsey, human nature is a descriptive concept, right? There is no prescription of what should be done next that comes as a result of studying human nature. We don't create a moral compass, right? That, like someone like Kant would say that if you like look at human nature, you will get into this kind of core of it that is rational, and from rationality you get to morality. So, for someone like Kant, you definitely can move from description to prescription. For Ramsey, that doesn't mean anything, right? Depending on like all the other things that we want, something might work as enhancement, sometimes not work as enhancement. The question of value, what we want, is outside the question of what we are as human nature. At best, human nature could give us like, a realistic map of like our possibilities, right? That, given the fact that so and so is so entrenched in humanity, and these are the causal links that connect these traits to one another, if we start like messing with that element in us, we might, face very severe consequences. Or the amount of change that we're going to see is going to be very unpredictable and intense. Sure. But it doesn't tell us we shouldn't do it. We should do it. And it really depends on who is asking, right? So in that sense, for Ramsey, human nature as a scientific concept has nothing to do with morality. Morality is its own thing, human nature is its own thing, and we could, say that, in a very kind of hypothetical imperatives, we can say that if we want to have a stable society, we need to enhance so and so. We need to keep these traits as opposed to other traits, and then go and say that, hey, how much we can have control over this, how much of this is part of our current nature, and how much of it is not, and then that would be it. Human nature could be used as a raw material, but it's not the compass itself. Trent?
Yes, I think the main things I want to say are probably just like the previous slide we should reserve it for next critique episode or response episode. Here, I just want to point out that, at least in my observation, he's very coherent. Human nature belongs to the domain of science. And like Max Weber says, science and politics have their own places, so we should not confuse the two. So he is very much against the naive transparency, translatability camp that will say, oh, we have a scientific description of humankind, and we can just directly take this into policy making, into morality. He say, no. We are, as a scientist of human nature, we are articulating on behalf of the whole society the risk and the benefits for doing anything, but how our society is going to do such a thing is up to the realm of politics. In a totalitarian regime, our knowledge, scientific knowledge, is just serve a board of like, I don't know, dictators for them to decide. But in the liberal democracy, perhaps we can vote on like whether we want to enhance a certain. But like science is transcending ideological or moral disagreements. So I think with that we can. And so, dear listeners, thanks for staying with us, and please stay tuned. Next episode, we are gonna discuss our response to Ramsey's theory and kind of talking about the really interesting openings that reading his book has made it explicit to us. So, see you next time.